Hello and welcome. Welcome to Gendered Thoughts on Peace and Justice. We have three panelists coming up for you. We have Melissa coming to us from, St. Norbert College. We have Michaela here from the University of Notre Dame. And then we have Hilarina on with us from NYU. So we've got some varied institutions with us. We're very excited for these presentations. We're going to give each of these lovely ladies 15 minutes to present on their abstract and their paper related to gendered thoughts on peace and justice. And then we're going to break into a Q&A session, and you can put your questions to any of the three panelists, and we'll get started with Melissa, who again is coming to us from St. Norbert College, which is, I believe, in Wisconsin. Is that right?
Yes, in DePere, Wisconsin is by Green Bay.
Okay. How is your weather up there?
It's still kind of chilly, unfortunately, but we're hoping to get nicer weather starting next week.
We had snow this morning, so we feel it.
Yeah, we did too. It's been snowing the past couple of days, so hopefully it'll be better.
Well, thank you, Melissa. You can go ahead and get started. You have 15 minutes, and I'll let you know when you're getting close to your 15 minutes.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. Well, like Francesca was introducing me, thank you for that. My name is Melissa Andrade Ramos. I am a junior here in St. Norbert College. I am studying political science and international studies, hoping to go into law school starting when I graduate, so next year. So my topic right now, I was researching the effectiveness of the feminist advances on the eradication of gender violence and the protection of Indigenous women in Mexico. My primary focus right now is in how the government and governmental and non-governmental organizations are supporting these communities when it comes to victims and survivors of gender violence. So gender violence in Mexico is a very big issue. It's been affecting the population since centuries ago, but just in the recent 2 decades, the amount of femicides, which is a homicide of a person and a woman specifically, based solely on the idea of her gender, has increased almost to double since the 1990s. So that's something that worry that has increased in Mexico a lot. So just in 2020, we see that over 19 million women over the age of 15 have reported being victims of some type of gender violence by their romantic partners. Out of these women, only 48.2% of them spoke about their experience or reported it to any type of authority. Just to put into perspective, in Mexico in 2020, there were just over 61 million women. So we're talking about over the age of 15. So we're talking about a third of the women in Mexico that had experienced some type of gender violence by the age of 15. So out of all the women in Mexico, Indigenous women are less likely to report the aggressions other than non-Indigenous women, and they're also more prone to experience domestic violence due to some of the cultures and the customs that we have. So a lot of the data that I collected comes directly from INEGI. So INEGI stands for the National Institution of Geographic and Statistics and the National Institution of Statistics and Geographic Information. So it stands in Spanish for it. This is a press release number 568, number 20/20. So this primarily focuses on gender and gender violence and the report of these. So we're going to analyze a little more of that, which is my primary research. So our first graphic, it talks about the prevalence of violence among women, again, over the age of 15. In this graphic, we see that the data is collected and divided by different demographics. The first couple of them, we see the rural and urban separation. We see the violence is more experienced in urban areas. And at the bottom, we see the Indigenous homes are less likely to report any type of violence. We also see in the middle of these that women who have some type of education are more like women who have higher education are more likely to report. So as the level allocation goes up, women are more likely to report their abuse and any type of aggressions that they have. So that's something to keep in mind as we go on with our presentation. And this other one here comes back to the idea that I talked in the beginning, where there was over 19 million women over the age of 15 who reported some type of abuse. Now it's broken down into different ideas. So out of the 48.2% of women who reported any type of abuse, they reported it. 79% of these women told a family member. 42.1% of them reported, told one of their friends, but only 6.5% reported to a lawyer or somebody with authority that could help them try to report them to authorities. And out of the authorities, I'm sorry. And only 14.9% reported to a psychologist and try to seek some type of therapy or some type of counseling for helping to get through the situation. Over here, we have a different approach into the idea of how many women reported or talked about their experience. We see that out of the 48.2%, 30.6% knew where to get some type of support or help or some type of resources for victims. And out of them, only 41.4% of them told somebody. So even if they know of the resources, they're not very likely to report. So this is something very interesting that I found. So I was trying to, when I was looking into this, I was trying to see why is this the case? Not just, one of them was education, like we were talking about. The other one we're talking about is the broader culture of Mexico. When we see that the women are hypersexualized, we see the women are being also told that they're not to be sexual beings. And we see this very, very extremely and very prevalent when it comes to media. Earlier, I talked about the increased number of femicides that are happening in Mexico. And we continue to see any newspapers and news reports that come up to them. And when it comes to that, we see that about 36% of the time when they're talking about femicides, they are talking about how they're justifying they're trying to justify the abuser. It is not about it's not just talking about to report what happened, but they are justifying what happened. A lot of times they use prompts like alcohol as being one of the justifiers. We see that the same alcohol is used to be like a victim blaming of the women, of the victim in this case. So we see a lot of double standards in the Mexican culture, unfortunately, and that is very prone in this. It really shows when it comes to media, when it comes to reports of gender violence, and especially femicides. So when it comes to the efforts that the Mexican government and non-governmental agencies are doing, primarily we see that non-governmental agencies have a lot of their information and resources online, which is a little problematic when it comes to Indigenous communities, because a lot of Indigenous communities have a lack of resources when it comes to internet, and even some don't have any access to telephone lines. So we have a lack of communication. We also have a lack of proper education in some of this Indigenous communities. So we see that a lot of elementary schools and middle schools have they have a lack of internet too. So there's no access to any type of information. But when it comes to governmental agencies, we see that the primary we have is the Justice Centers for Women, or Centros de Justicia para las Mujeres. And those are, they say, the most prevalent ones that we have, and they have more resources, and they tend to work a lot more with victims than we see any other agencies. This in particular, in this map, we see the distribution of these. Ones in the darker purple, it says it has 2 or more, but the The most that we have, it's 5, and that is located in Mexico City, right here in the middle. So we see that a large concentration of the centers are in the urban settings like this, but it's still a lack because only 5 centers for a bigger state is not enough. As we see around here, the bigger states are the one that have more, that have the majority, but the majority, again, it's only 2 or 3, as the most is 5, but the only is 2 or 3. And we see that states like Chihuahua, they can only have 2, but yet the state of Chihuahua it's large, and the geographical, when it comes to how the climate it is, it's very hard to move from one place to another to locate these resources. Compared to this map, I want to look into a distribution of indigenous communities in Mexico. So right here, we see a geographic distribution of them. So we see that a large amount of indigenous communities are in the center of Mexico, in the south, and the north, where Chihuahua is. So if we go back, Chihuahua is one of the states that has 2 or more centers, but those are located primarily in the cities, which are more towards the north of the state. And we see that the indigenous communities, as we see here, are more located towards the south. We also see that another area with a majority of indigenous communities is the south, where Campeche and Yucatan is. And when we look at the map, there's where like only 1 center is in the state. So we see a lack of the centers. And is this just one type of center? We also see that in this area, in this little area in the north halfway through the map, there's also where Nayarit and Jalisco are. There's only 2 or more in each, but we see there's very high concentration of indigenous communities and a diversity of these. Okay, now with this, I want to look at the map and also talk a little more about the education levels within indigenous communities, which also comes to the idea that with the lack of knowledge of the resources, so if you don't know you have a resource, you cannot achieve it. You cannot look for it. You cannot look into it. The other idea that we were talking about here that I look into my research is the culture within the families. So with this comes back to the idea of machismo, that comes with the idea of it comes back to sexism. Machismo is the concept that we use in Mexico and Latin America that is primarily focused in the idea that the man has some type of superiority or has some type of responsibility, and the woman has other type of responsibility, which is lower in level or class. So with the idea of machismo, women are seen like a second-class citizen, basically. So when it comes to this idea, we see that gender roles are really big. And one of the idea here is that women are not meant to study. Women are meant to be at home, and women are meant to be married. And once you're married, you're meant to stay in your marriage. And this really just supports the idea that once you are in a relationship, you can leave. So once they're in a relationship, like and they're being abused by their romantic partners, they don't leave. They have to stay, so they become a victim, and they see it as a normal thing within their daily life. So that just continues hurting these communities. So again, looking back to the broader picture, and the gender violence is a big thing in Mexico. Indigenous women, due to the lack of education, lack to the support of education, lack of the communications within indigenous communities and others, lack from the reach from agencies like it is a Center for Justice for Women and other and non-governmental organizations that are primarily focused just in internet sources. We see that indigenous women are statistically more prone to be victims and not reported. So now that we know why we have this situation, moving forward, I would like to research a little more into how and what methods can be used to reach to these women and help them get away from buying situations, don't be victims. And if you once a survivor falls into the category of being a survivor, how can they access the resources, and how can we make them these more accessible? One of them obviously would be communications, education, and another one that I was hoping to look into was language, as a lot of indigenous languages in Mexico are so prevalent, and for a lot of the smaller communities, like the ones in Michoacan, they are their first language.
Excellent job. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We're perfectly on time, great visuals. Thank you so much. Great way to start us off. We're gonna go right into our next presentation. Michaela or Mika,
Yeah.
as you prefer. Mika, take us away.
Thank you. Let me just wait for my slide. Yes. Sure. Let's see if it click over. So thanks everyone for coming. Good afternoon. I'll be presenting on my paper, Protecting the Powerless, Sanctions, Sexual Violence, and Civilian Protection in Conflict. So I just wanted to talk about two things first. First is I wanted to give a warning that there might be some triggering content because we're talking about sexual violence, statistics, and some cases. The other thing is I want us to acknowledge that we're currently on taken land. So we are currently on Native people's land, and this is the Potawatomi's land. And I like to think that the Peace Conference, among other things, are all of our other ways to understand how we can give justice to exploited peoples, including the people who traditionally own this land. So just want to put that there. Oops. Sorry.
It's like very finicky, unfortunately here.
There. Oh, let me just. Okay. So before anything, I think we should start with some key definitions that I'll be talking about throughout the presentation. So sanctions are the withdrawal of customary trade and financial relations for foreign and security policy purposes. So it's a coercive economic policy tool that's used by governments to constrain actors or entities' behaviors. And in our discussion, this is usually to constrain them from committing human rights violations that affect civilians. Civilian violence is defined as any acts through the use of force, harm, or damage to civilians or civilian targets, including lethal and non-lethal forms of violence. Sexual violence is a form of civilian violence, which involves a broader category that involves not just rape, but coerced undressing and non-penetrating sexual assaults, such as sexual mutilation, and also sexual humiliation, such as those enacted by the US troops and other prison systems. So to kind of foreground our discussion, I wanted to give some statistics to show that this is a very urgent issue. 35 million women and girls are needing humanitarian assistance. 1 out of every 5 women are in armed conflict settings experience sexual or gender-based violence, or SGBV. For children, that's 1 out of every 6, and 98% of conflict-related sexual violence, or CRSV, are cases against girls. Less than 1% of humanitarian aid goes to SGBV initiatives. In current conflicts, we also have a bleak picture. In Ukraine, there are at least 3,000 casualties that are recorded, and we're still counting. Observers have already talked about how SGBV is probably occurring on the ground, but again, we're not really recording it because this is stuff that happens under the radar. In Palestine, over 6,000 civilian casualties since 2008. And gender-based violence is very high in the Gaza Strip. In Ethiopia, over 500,000 people have died from starvation and violence. The registered rape victims range from 512 to 516, and 10,000 to 26,000 need SGBV services currently. This is only a 16-month-long conflict. With Myanmar, 1,500 people have died in the year-long protest that began in February 1, not including those who are murdered in custody. Almost 9,000 people are still in custody, and there are at least 10 documented reports, including ages 14 to 62. These are all lower bound estimates because of how civilian violence usually plays out in conflict, and also sexual violence. These are things, there's very high levels of impunity So we usually don't know what's happening on the ground. Thank you. So yeah, this research problem is really to tie together two bodies of literature. One is on the sanctions and one is on conflict-related sexual violence. I'm interested in sanctions because after the Cold War, we saw a shift from military intervention to interest in economic peace, which means that sanctions have been increasingly used. Since the 90s, we've had at least 45 sanction regimes, and at least 12 of them are still active. And there's more because of the current conflicts. There are mixed findings on the effectiveness of sanctions and dealing with civilian violence. And CRSV is interesting to me because there always is a systematic use of sexual violence in conflict, but we often don't really talk about it. So we know it's there, and at every conflict we assume that there's sexual violence, but we can't measure it. And that's really a problem. So this research problem is to kind of track what are the preliminary findings and emergent challenges in using sanctions to address conflict-related sexual violence. So to really understand this issue, we have to look into the literature. And let's look first at the issues in studying civilian violence and conflict-related sexual violence. In civilian violence in general, we have issues of identification, accountability, and response. In identification, we have problems with data reliability because you don't know how to get this data. There's also focus on crimes that are usually in urban settings, extreme crimes, or the ones that involve immense casualties. So other kinds of crimes are not usually as recorded. Accountability becomes a problem because when the crime, we have a hard time designating whether a crime is interstate or intrastate. We have a problem understanding which are the powerful actors and what is the state context and what is needed for longer term approaches for transitional justice. Response is connected to accountability problems. So on the one hand, your problem is you don't know which groups are particularly responsible for civilian attacks and which are the particular people from these groups should you sanction or should you punish when things happen badly. A question that I always think about is when mass rape of women and girls and boys and men is conducted, who do you hold accountable? Only the generals or everybody who participates? And how do you know who participates? This is not just a legal problem as we see in cases, but it's also a very big moral problem because we don't know how to understand accountability. With conflict-related sexual violence in particular, there are also some issues. Your issues is that there's no consensus in the definition of what conflict-related sexual violence entails. There's also issues of sexual violence reliability because the ones usually reporting morbidity rates are militaries. And militaries only report killings and usually the injured. This is even a bigger problem when the military themselves participate in sexual violence. And this is usually a trend that they do participate in sexual violence. So of course, they're not going to self-report. Another issue is we have an issue of categorizing sexual violence because it often occurs behind closed doors. So the frequency and the severity of how sexual violence plays out in conflict, we don't know very well. We have ideas that this is bad, but then unless we flesh it out, it's going to be very hard. But if there's a line of hope, we have growing scholarly interest in conflict-related sexual violence. So I'm just going to breeze through this, but this framework is basically something I created this diagram to show all of the documents and principles and guidelines that guide civilian protection and conflict-related sexual violence. The one in purple is on conflict-related sexual violence in particular, and the yellow one is only in civilian violence generally. So there's a lot of international tools that guide and condemn civilian violence and sexual violence. Our issue is not that it's not a norm. The problem is we're having issues in actually addressing it. We know it's bad, but we don't know how to address it. So before we talk about sexual violence and how it's addressed by sanctions, I want to talk about first how sanctions have fared in dealing with civilian protection. Sanctions have mixed findings. And some scholars say that civilian protection and humanitarian relief is hindered by sanctions, but there's also a potential to lower casualties when they're more targeted. Farrell is one of the best resources for the kind of anti-sanctions because he studies how civilian violence plays out and how mass atrocity crimes are addressed using sanctions. So he states that there's a correlation between sanctions and higher levels of genocide. And the effectivity of sanctions depends on measurable goals. The problem is in a lot of earlier sanctions, earlier being the last 5 to 20 years, there's not very like clear set goals. And one of the good examples he shows is the Iraqi sanctions. So the Iraqi sanctions is considered one of the best sanction regimes, successful ones, because it deterred Hussein from building arms, but it also caused a water crisis that killed millions of people. And that it's considered one of the biggest humanitarian crises caused by sanctions. The problem is sanctions are also considered a trapdoor and could be a trapdoor to the use of force. And that just basically means that in some places they use sanctions and military intervention, which ruins the whole idea of sanctions, because what you try to do with sanctions is to try to get all of these actors on the table and say, I'm taking this away from you, but if you change something, I'll give it back to you. And if you use military intervention, the incentives are broken. So accountability and justice is also a problem, because delisting individuals who are actually listed but are not, but have been proven not to be partaking in violence that's been kind of assigned to them has been difficult. We've seen this in 9/11, we saw this in Andrade. It's been hard because there's some level of lawlessness when it comes to that. That's why Farrell recommends 3 things. One is a careful application of sanctions, and that is mindful of unintended consequences. The other is to use it in conjunction of other instruments that aren't military, but are also diplomatic international instruments. Finally, sanctions should be reformed to increase accountability and have precise indicators of success to responsibility to protect goals. So just briefly, responsibility to protect is one of the civilian protection guidelines from the UN. So it should be considering it more explicitly. But some authors also talk about the potential of sanctions, especially when they're targeted. Park and Choi did a quantitative analysis of sanctions and saw that narrow scope sanctions are usually less detrimental to civilian populations. Lopez also talked about these countries, Libya and Liberia and others, identifying preliminary successes in deterring military buildup. So we see our problem here is that there's mixed findings, and most of the findings is in success in deterring military buildup. So the change needs to be the need to explicitly consider civilian protection when we're designing sanctions, because it needs to be an actual thing that we're thinking about when we're designing sanctions. So focusing specifically on sexual violence, very few reports actually focus on this. So we can look at Huve's 2018 report, who talks about sanctions and conflict-related sexual violence. So she identifies some opportunities and challenges, which I want to go through. On opportunities, some sanction regimes do explicitly include SGBV crimes as one of the designation criteria, which is kind of good. The other thing is that there's also other regimes that have broad human rights violations that include SGBV as one of the violations. And in 2010, at least, there was the first official who was designated that one of his human rights violations was the command of mass rape of women and girls in the DRC. And finally, an opportunity is there is greater interest in this issue, which is something we can continue building on. Challenges really are rooted in the fact that SGBV is used as a designation criteria is used inconsistently, applied late, and often ignored. So we see that the ones who are listed individuals that do have sexual violence allegations, only 16 of them have been designated with it. So very few individuals are actually kind of look through these lens, and no entity or individual has been designated solely as CRSV grounds. And finally, the thing is, sanctions are framed with very generic violations. So just saying human rights violations is one of the ways to sanction someone, but there are so many kinds, including sexual violence. But we need to be specific if we want to be dealing with this problem. So just to sum that up, sexual violence remains under-addressed, and there's a lack of coordination from international bodies rather than the lack of resources. So one of the things Huve touches on is that cooperation between the special representative of sexual violence and conflict in the UN does not coordinate very well with the current sanction committees. So you see that there's good research about this, but it's not trickling back down to actual practice and sanctions. And she also kind of criticizes that there's a lack of political will, because there are internal debates in the UN of whether this should be a priority in humanitarian crisis, but it should be, as we've seen in statistics. So there is a mixed effectiveness of sanctions, but there are real and tangible failures in civilian protection that we need to think about. And sanctions remain an underutilized tool when it comes to addressing sexual violence. But we also see some seeds of hope. So the work of the special representative involves reports and having teams that work on this. So they have a lot of expertise that just needs to trickle down. On Huve's 2018 report, they also have, if they're taken seriously, they're very good recommendations. One is to create a separate designation criteria to be sanctioned against sanctioning individuals based only on their sexual violence crimes. The other is that there should be an inclusion of efforts to address sexual violence and the fight against impunity. So it should be also a reason to pull out sanctions. If you're able to lower levels of sexual violence, sanctions should also be considering that. And also finally, since this is a very small field, there's very limited evidence, but there's a data set created by Cohen and Nordas. And one of their key findings is that the state militaries commit more sexual violence than rebel groups and militias. So this gives us a clear policy indication that we should be looking to state militaries when we're trying to train against sexual violence. So as a conclusion, we can see that sanctions and sexual violence scholarship provides potential findings on how targeted sanctions could actually address sexual violence and conflict. So given the current conflicts, there is a need to ensure that research on this is quickly informing policy, because we see that the trend is always there, but the research field is small. So we need to make sure that this is always being integrated quickly, which has always been a problem, I think. And I think this is a problem because, as it states, like sexual violence is correlated with trauma, intergenerational trauma, social stigma, cyclical poverty, health issues, and unwanted pregnancies. But I think as a feminist and as a person who's really interested in peace, and for everyone listening, I think we need to acknowledge that wars are not waged only on landscapes, but they're waged also on bodies and in minds. And that being able to have this holistic understanding of injustice is the best way for us to actually reimagine what justice and peace really look like. So I wanted to leave that with you guys, and thank you for listening.
Great job. Two great presentations so far. We have one more coming to us, Hilarina, who again is coming to us from New York University. You can go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for the organizing committee for the opportunity to present. And special thank you to Francesca for handling my slides. Just to give you a quick overview of what I'll be covering. So I'll briefly discuss women and peace building and women's participation in Colombia's peace process. Next, I will compare the implementation of all stipulations in the final accord in comparison to those that explicitly include a gender lens, specifically focusing on women's participation measures based on the findings of the Kroc Institute. Third, I'll introduce the proposed intervention with an interdisciplinary dimension, drawing upon the work of John Paul Lederach and Abraham Maslow. And lastly, I'll address possible critiques in terms of the limitations of the intervention and its potential for success. So this is just a quote that I found so interesting and I wanted to share it with you because I think it's very important to understand that, you know, a peace agreement doesn't mean peace for a country, and there's a lot more that goes into it. If you can go to the next slide, you will see Now, in terms of Colombia, Colombia's peace agreement appears to have resulted in escalated concerns of poverty, inequality, and security as violence continues to ravage the country. Reports, these are just clips of news clippings that I found online, and reports since the 2016 plebiscite, when a narrow majority of participants voted against the deal and before it ultimately was approved by Congress, have increasingly painted the bleak picture, as you can see, in terms of the status of peace in the country. So just a quick, in looking at women and peace building, it's a huge topic that 50 minutes is not enough to talk about, but in a nutshell, studies show that men and women are affected differently by conflict and peace building, and there is a need to address such differences to bring about sustainable peace. There's also research that peace agreements involving women are 35% more likely to last 15 years or more, and that gender equality is the #1 predictor of peace. When we look at the timeline of women's participation in Colombia's peace process, I apologize that this is very tiny, the wording, but just to give you like an overview of it is, so when the peace agreement was signed in on November 24th, 2016, it was hailed as one of the most inclusive of women's voices. And as you can see, the road to women's participation in Colombia's peace process has been a long one, and from essentially no representation to women being appointed as plenipotentiary negotiators. So it's not been a straight line, and it's been a journey to involve women during the peace process. But those mediating between the FARC and the Colombian government in the last decade arranged for both parties to meet regularly with women's and civil society groups. Who successfully lobbied for the inclusion in the final peace deal for provisions of gender equality, women's rights, and reparations. And as a result of including women in the peace agreement, this went beyond addressing the combatants' needs, and it advanced justice and offered restitution for human rights violations which were endured during the war. So what changed? According to the Brookings Institute, President Marquez, who won the election as president on the promise to fix the agreement's deficiencies, has consistently slow rolled its implementation. And as I noticed in the Kroc Institute report, that the provisions of the agreement specific to women have been the least executed. Next slide. So I did an analysis of a comparison of the implementation of all stipulations with those that are explicitly include the gender lens. And based on the analysis, the Institute had identified 578 stipulations in the text of the final agreement, out of which 130 have a gender lens. As monitored by the Institute as of June 30th, 2018, the figure 1 on the left reflects the implementation of the 578 stipulations of the Colombian Peace Accord, while figure 2 on the right reflects the 130 commitments of those stipulations in the agreement that have an explicit gender lens. So based on the analysis, we see that 37% of the stipulations of the peace agreement were yet to be initiated, while 31% had a minimal implementation status. Additionally, 10% of the stipulations were in the intermediate level of implementation, while 22% of the agreement have been fully implemented. In contrast, when we look at figure 2, we see that more than half, that's 51% to be exact, of the implementations with the gender lens were yet to be initiated, while 38 had a minimal implementation status. Additionally, 7% of the stipulations were in the intermediate level implementation, while only 4% of the stipulations with the gender lens had been fully implemented. When comparing the 51% of the stipulations with the gender lens and that have not been initiated with the 37% that have been initiated, the analysis shows that there's a 14% gap of initiation of commitments with the gender lens. Lastly, when comparing the 22% of the general stipulations that have been completed with the 4% stipulations with the gender lens, it shows that there is 18% gap of completion of commitments with the gender lens. Interestingly, yet unsurprisingly, among the 4 main topics that are said to have been identified as premises of, by key actors and women's organizations during the Kroc Institute's technical working groups, women's participation in the agreement's implementation process was noted as an important one. So based on further analysis, the report goes on to identify 5 aspects of women's participation that are crucial to the implementation of the final agreement. These are what you see on the screen. What's important to recognize here is that women's participation requires consideration of the official, semi-official, and unofficial roles at play in peace building. And more importantly, their participation cannot and should not be limited to the formal peace table. Next slide. So due to the immense potential of women's advocacy organizations in influencing Colombia's peace process and the varying levels of leadership in which they operate, I proposed LEDERAC's peace building pyramid as the framework for the intervention. The framework was also chosen because it allows for what LEDERAC calls insider parties, similar to what William Ury refers to as the third side roles, in recognizing the official, semi-official, and unofficial roles women play in peace building, as well as the 5 aspects of women's participation identified in the previous slide. Additionally, the framework could also allow for what LEDERAC refers to as vertical and horizontal capacity within the pyramid, which is essential to the participation of Indigenous women's groups whose voices are especially important when it comes to implementing the peace agreement. There is, however, a slight deviation in the proposed framework from LEDERAC's version of the pyramid to that of Sidonia Angom's adaptation. So in her book, Women in Peace Building and Peacemaking and Peace Building in Northern Uganda, Sidonia Angom combines gender-sensitive methodologies with LEDERAC's peace building pyramid. What you see on the screen right now is her version of that. So a similar approach is suggested for the proposed intervention in the context of peace building to improve women's participation in Colombia's peace agreement and to ensure continuous peace building post-accord. In the context of Colombia, examples of what some of the actors would look like would include, for example, in engaging level 1 actors in top leadership could be the Route of Women. It's also known as the Ruta Pacifica de las Mujeres. And also in terms of engaging level 2 actors in middle leadership, it could include women of various faith traditions who play a substantial role in mediating conflicts within communities. And lastly, in terms of, as an example for grassroots leadership, it could be other female Indigenous groups that could be involved in, in the different levels of the pyramid. So based on the importance of assessing the needs of the actors of each of these levels, who fall on each of these levels of the pyramid, we could argue that the peace building pyramid lacks this component because we don't really look at their needs specifically. So that's where I build in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, because in his pyramid, he identifies 5 categories of needs in a tiered order. Although these needs have been contested in terms of the hierarchical nature and subsequent iterations have also been introduced, I believe they could be used as a foundation in this regard in identifying and addressing women's participatory needs in relation to the implementation of the peace process in these different levels. Therefore, taking this intervention a step further, what I proposed in my paper was to incorporate a needs assessment based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs framework, and then mapping it to the peace building pyramid as reflected. If you can just click once. So, and again, yes, Thank you. So just to show you like how it connects to the how you can connect Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the letter X pyramid is what you see now. I believe that the insider partials identified, so letter X identified something called insider partials, and these could be ensure that the needs are kind of negotiated and met across all levels of leadership due to their horizontal and vertical capacity, which could address, the concern of like the hierarchical needs aspect. And in doing so, women's advocacy organizations and other actors within these levels could have greater success in participation. So just to summarize what I showed from the graph, so the next is what you see, I put it in also in a table. The next and final step of this intervention is also, so you have the actors identified, and then you have needs assessment done for all of those actors. And the last step of this process is also to identify what indicators would show on each of these levels. So drawing upon the lessons from the intersectionality between gender equality, conflict, and peace building, and in line with letter X thinking, the Canadian International Development Agency, also known as CIDA, suggests using participatory approaches rather than top-down initiatives in building gender equality and peace. CIDA further suggests a framework with possible indicators based on the 5 entry points to be used in peace-building settings, which is what you see on the far right corner of the table. So due to their compatibility with the proposed intervention, I recommend using this framework to map back to the needs in Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So women's participation is measured in relation to their needs as a holistic intervention process. So in the previous table, you would see I only put on the top 5 areas, but then the next slide shows as you go into depth in terms of what the indicators would be to assess these 5 areas. Lastly, I think it's important also to kind of discuss the limitations of this and also address, its potential for success. So to ensure that the intervention has the greatest potential for success, it's important to address 2 key limitations, one being that the data obtained from the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies, that was used for the purpose of the analysis is from 2018. So it would be helpful to obtain more recent data to identify what areas of the peace agreement are specifically slow in implementation and are still yet to be initiated from a gender lens. So we can analyze further the 5 areas post-accord in the 5 years since the agreement was signed. Another limitation is that the actors identified for letter X peace building pyramid is not an inclusive list of all existing advocacy organizations in Colombia, and there could be other key actors that have emerged since the agreement was signed, and they would also need to be identified and included to make sure that the pyramid is an inclusive one. Nonetheless, it's important to recognize that the unique needs specific to women are not being adequately addressed in the implementation of Colombia's peace agreement, despite the gendered nature of armed conflict and peace and the critical need for more gender inclusive implementation of the existing agreement towards sustaining peace for not just women, but for all Colombians. As women continue to take on multiple roles in the peace building process as caregivers or victims or change agents or advocates, and as advisors or facilitators, it's important to remember that the official peace table is not just one of it's only just one of the plethora of tables in which women need to participate at in order to successfully close the gaps identified in implementation. Ensuring the inclusion of women not only at official tables, but also around and beyond such tables is equal, if not more important in the peace building process. This is also why adapting letter X peace building pyramid from a gender lens perspective, whilst ensuring that their needs are met, would provide its greatest opportunity for success. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. We now have, I think, about 20 minutes to take questions from any of you individuals here physically in the room with us or any on the webinar online. So if anyone wants to start us off with a question here in person or online. While you're all thinking of your questions, I can go ahead with the question. I'm gonna start one question for Melissa. Thank you again for your presentation, very well done. My question was regarding the institutions in Mexico. So you did a great job of demonstrating the relationship between the location of these gender justice centers and the indigenous peoples of Mexico. I'm wondering, is there any, or did you find this in your research? Is there any indication of the relationship between indigenous peoples and the police force? I think what I'm trying to get at is I've heard that there are varying levels of the effectiveness when it comes to the state or the police force in Mexico, and it generally varies by location. So would you say that the effectiveness of the police force in these locations varies? Or is it, yeah, that's a lot of questions wrapped into one.
Yeah, yes, like you said, it usually varies a lot. I did look into this a little bit, but the level of policing usually in indigenous communities, because they're at the most part some rural areas, is very limited. So there's not much information that I had to bring to be a bigger point in my research. I did look into a little more when it comes to cases that actually get into the justice system, and that has also a lot of variations, something that it will have to be like one paper, just one research, just focus on how the justice system takes care of gender violence, which is very, it has a really great variation because Mexico has enacted really great laws that protects Mexican women from gender violence, but yet you see that there's not much of justice done to any of the victims. So we see it's really big gap. So that would have to be researched by it.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that it strikes me as a very interesting question. So thank you for bringing our attention to that. Anybody else?
And any online participants, if you can use the Q&A feature, please go ahead and drop something in there. Or if you want to speak out loud, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you.
I have a question for Mika. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about why the UN does not prioritize this conflict. As you said, even like with the stats are clear. Why is it that sexual violence is even secondary?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think it's a good question. I think it comes down to a lot of what we talked about. I think women's issues or gender issues in particular are considered and traditionally considered something that's secondary. So when we talk about humanitarian relief, most people are thinking, and even I was shaped to think, that it's water, it's food, it's probably clothes, and you're not thinking too much about services. And particularly I have a feeling that, yeah, it really boils down to the fact that because sexual violence is something we understand that is because of it opens up a bunch of complex things which our system has not been built to accommodate. So for example, providing health services for women, it's not enough to give them physical health services. So we know that in sexual violence, sometimes it requires genital reconstruction, all kinds of these things. but not only do they not prioritize that with donors and all levels and everything, but you'll also need to have therapy. You'll need to be focusing on community healing. So I think it also is not just because it's a gender issue, but it's also an issue of thinking about justice issues in the long term. So with sexual violence, it involves a lot of trauma, and healing requires longer term ideas of justice and transitional justice. And I don't think we've gotten to a place where we think about issues like that. We're always often just trying to, cover holes as they appear and hope things that come out well, and whoever survives are the people we're gonna give therapy to. But then the truth is we're losing so much people and we're hurting so many people, and this sexual violence is correlated with so many things, as I mentioned, increases in crime, lawlessness. It's gonna be very hard for societies to heal even after conflict. In fact, like I forgot to mention a while ago, but one of the findings by Cohen and Nordas is that state militaries do not only do more sexual violence during conflict, but they often usually are the ones who continue to doing it post-conflict period too. So you can see that the problem is really structural, I think.
Thank you.
So I have a question going on.
Yeah.
Just a question of measurement, but I think it's far more than that, actually. So how, if you're considering applying sanctions to a country in an attempt to prevent or punish the use of sexual violence in conflict, how do you determine, or have you encountered any within the literature, how do you determine the difference between sexual violence that's being used as a tactic and is prevalent from that which it melts into numerous other atrocities?
I think that's a good question. I was thinking about this actually while I was going here. And I think it has something to do with doing what Professor Hooker talked about yesterday on like dirty work. So the important thing is what our problem is, not only do we not have institutions in place to hold people accountable, we also don't have the right incentive systems to incentivize societies to not do sexual violence. And the whole thing is that that's long work, which involves making people accept that it's unacceptable to commit sexual violence. So you'd need to change norms, you'd need to, which is a longer term process, you need to build institutions that have the right incentive sets. And it also has, we really have to confront also what are the definitions. So one thing you see with a lot of human rights violations, especially with sexual violence, they have a hard time defining it. So I think they multilateral bodies should be working with local bodies to understand what kinds of sexual violence occurs. And then I think starting to be able to measure it, as well as simultaneously figuring out what constructs do we propagate as norms, like sexual violence being not acceptable, is important to kind of like do together. And then it will be a while for things to change, but building that infrastructure and those institutions and those changes and the way we think about sexual violence is something we need to start now. So that was a long way of answering, but in the literatures, what we have is a lot of data of how it happens and what happens, but they're all lower bound estimates, and there's not really a way for us to do policy wise yet. That's why I think the research needs to get to the policy to think really hard on this.
I have a question for Carolina. What advice would you give to women who might want to get involved in the peace building process, but don't know like where to start?
Sorry, can you just repeat the question? I couldn't hear it.
What advice would you give to women who want to get involved in the peace building process, but they don't know where to start?
Women, I think, who want to have a career in peace building, or women in terms on the ground want to get involved in?
Yeah, like on the ground.
So what I have learned through my classes and all my research is that you don't, I think I put it as a quote also, it's, so we sometimes tend to think like you define or like you identify yourself as a peace builder, but everyone in their own roles are a peace, is a peace builder. They don't have to have the formal name of a peace builder to be a peace builder. Women, especially women, are understood and accepted around the world as being peace builders, and it starts even from the smallest context of like the family. And they're also such, not just in the peacemaking process, they also research shows that women's involved, the importance of including women in the peace building process is even more important, because they're the ones who usually end up having to, after war, there's a lot of casualties. More women become heads of households, more women become caretakers, because you have victims of war and they have to take care of them. They have orphans who have lost their parents because of war. They also become the primary caregivers for their family. So all of those aspects go into the fact that they are a peace builder, and that's why it's so important. So like, to answer your question, I think that there are different levels. Even in the smallest way, they can become peace builders, and it's not necessarily they need to have a formal, they don't need to form a formal organization or be part of a formalized process to be a peace builder. And they can be a peace builder even in the context of their family, in their communities, and there are different levels of that. Does that help answer your question?
Yes, thank you. So I have a question going off of that. To flip the advice question in a slightly different way, you're speaking to us. We're here at the Kroc Center at the University of Notre Dame, the place where a lot of those statistics that you quoted were compiled. If you were to give advice to the Peace Accords matrix who's overseeing the implementation of the Columbia Peace Accords, what advice, if any, would you give to them to perhaps better the way we measure those, the gender pieces of the Peace Accord, or on the ground, how do you better implement? Measure it or implement?
Measure or implement?
Either one, whichever you prefer. What advice would you give to the team here?
I think it's important to go. My answer might be half complete, just because I don't know. I didn't go into detail in terms of, I don't know how you gather or measure, gather the data. I don't know if they actually go to the site and then on the ground they work with the grassroots organizations and are getting into that level and kind of gather data, or they gather it from whatever is reported to them from the governments. I don't know how that works. Given that lack of knowledge, I would suggest that they go on the ground and get the data, which is much more, and also talk to the people there and also get much more information through that means, because it's not only in terms of what's reported, but also what's not reported. Just like, all these women's issues are so connected, and there's also a lot of intersectionality, like even like in gender-based violence, there's so much we know that there's not reported. So if we only base our evaluations based on what's reported, that data might be biased, and based on different regions, different people, it could be awareness creation, and like all of that ties into the fact of like how much gets reported in the end. So as much as evaluation and measurement is important, we cannot just base that totally on what's being given to us. We need to have like a broader understanding, I think, and going into grassroots organizations, at the grassroots level, and having those discussions at that point would help, I think, enrich the measurement of, what, and the analysis of the implementation of the Peace Accord. And I am originally from Sri Lanka, and I grew up during the Civil War. So I understand like what the perspective is as a person who was part, lived during the Civil War and during that time and how I saw things as opposed to how it's being reported and what's being seen as an outsider. So I think that sometimes there could be deviations in the perspectives you get. And so it's always important to get that other side, which you might not get, and going to rural areas and understanding what they are facing and what kind of peace building mechanisms that they need to ensure that they are able to, and to kind of connect to the previous question of like how to ensure that women, like what advice would you give women peace builders, like what do they need to be effective implementations of the, peace building process would then kind of inform what you measure. So, because in the end, what you measure also has to be something that's important and would then inform your action. So what you can take, it should inform the next steps. If not, you're not utilizing the data you're collecting. So it has to be like a 360 view, in my opinion.
Sounds good to me. Anybody from online, anyone watching the webinar, maybe you're in the midst of typing your question, just go ahead and hit send if you were. Happy to answer any questions you have. Anybody else here in person? Okay. I can do one more round of questions. I've got more questions. Nobody else here? Okay, coming back to Melissa. Thinking about what you presented to us and a lot of the correlations that you found between education and culture and institutionalization, how much of the challenge do you think for Indigenous peoples can be described as the difference between rural and urban? Would you say that is the largest discrepancy between these two? Say, you're in Mexico City, you have an urban center, you have access to these justice centers, you have better education, you have, I forget the other indicators better institutions. The police are more effective in Mexico City. Would you say that the rural-urban divide is, where would you rank it in terms of its importance for explaining the phenomena?
I would say it is the second. I feel like when it comes to geographical location, it does help a lot when it comes to like urban areas. We do see that in urban areas there's like a higher risk for gender violence, but again, the research are there. I feel like our first one would be the culture of Mexico, not just within the indigenous communities, but like the culture in Mexico overall. It is still very machista, it's still very sexist. They focus a lot into the victim blaming other than just reporting the news like I was talking before. I think that will be our first one when it comes to geographical locations. Rural areas do lack a lot of resources, and I feel like that will be our second one. But yeah, benefit culture definitely is the first one. There's also like the culture prevents people from like seeking help, if that makes sense, because when it comes to looking for help, like a lot of women are told to like, you're the women, so you can take it up, you're tough, you should know how to do this happens, it's okay, like it is what it is. But that just like again comes back to the culture itself.
Sounds good. All right, well, thank you again. One more call out for questions. All right. Well, thank you to Melissa, to Mika, to Hilarina. All three of you did a wonderful job. I keep researching what you're researching. We need it. The world needs it, and the world needs you to keep thinking about these questions and to find solutions to these problems. So you guys said the future. I know you hear that all the time. That's pretty corny, but it's really true. We need your brain, so keep it up. Thank you all so much, and thank you everyone here for being here and everyone who's here virtually. Again, we're coming to you. This is a Student Peace Conference at the Kroc Institute at the University of Notre Dame. This has been Gendered Thoughts on Peace and Justice. Thank you.